while the Iraqi army and the Kurdish army, the Peshmerga, fights on the ground against these guys. And that latter piece is going to take a political agreement in Baghdad, which we see this morning is getting even more difficult to get.
The prime minister America put in control of Iraq has stepped down, largely in part because America realized the massive mistake he really was. Once again, the government of this fractured country is remaking itself, and once again, the world has to understand what it all means with regard to human rights, constant war, and the battle always being fought on the economic front. Just because there's a new guy in charge doesn't mean the landmines have been deactivated. Welcome back to MidPoint. Former member of the UK Parliament, the senior economic consultant for Euro-Pacific Capital, John Browne, joins us again on the show. John,
good
always
morning,
a pleasure
Ed.
to see you. Good
Thank
morning.
you so much.
Let's get right down to it. Al-Maliki is gone, finally decides to walk away, but is there really any change that we can expect in any short order?
Well, you know, Prime Minister Harold Wilson made a very wise remark in the 1960s. He said, a week in politics is a long time. And it seems like everything is turned on its head in a week. I personally think that on the surface, things look very changed. I mean, we have, as you say, the Prime Minister put out, and Iran, which is really holds the big grip there, agreeing to a Kurdish Sunni's choice as the next Prime Minister. I think that's remarkable, and on the surface we've achieved a veritable miracle in saving the genocide. The potential genocide was fantastic, but the big question for the world to answer is what happened under the table. That's all on the table. What's happened under the table, and I suspect, I have no inside information, but I suspect that America, in order to pull the support of Iran to get rid of their puppet, Maliki, they've made a major concession on the nuclear arms deal, or the nuclear deal for Iran. And I suspect that it's going to be very costly to the world later on. We won't ever discover what the deal was, but I don't see miracles happening in politics. There's usually a deal under the table.
Well, you also mentioned the Kurds and the Sunnis being involved here, and that's all part of the deal here. Now, because no matter how much we've talked about this in the last couple of weeks, depending on the individual, it's always the Kurds. Arm the Kurds, put weapons in the hands of the Kurds, and let them at least get something done. Why is there so much confidence? Granted, the Peshmerga, wonderful fighters, that's what everybody tells us, but why should we put so much confidence in them being able to grab some control here?
Well, I personally think, well, first of all, you said the key thing, they're great fighters. And that's a key thing, people that we could provide weapons to and support and intelligence, and they would use it well. Without our troops having to be on the ground. It was, I think, a very viable thing to go for our politicians. But the thing now is what's going to happen in the future. And I think you're going to see in Iraq break down into a provisional government, a provincial government. In other words, I think they're going to carve out the northwest area for the Kurds, the northeast area for the Sunnis, and the south for the Shiites. And I think there will be a central government, but with much less power. And I think the combination of a Sunni president and a Shiite prime minister, and the acquiescence, strange acquiescence of Iran under pressure and agreement, giving away things possibly in the treaty by America, I think you're going to see very strong provincial government come out, and therefore peace.
Why do we always seem to miss Iran in this equation? We talk an awful lot specifically about ISIS coming from Syria and America not doing enough in Syria. We talk about trying to set it up here and do this and set this piece up here. But we don't really kind of bring Iran into the conversation much. Why do we keep missing them?
I think it's sort of almost psychological, not wishing to see the really awful sight. You push it under the table.
But isn't that it too, that America does not want to see? If we could do it without it, the American government would much prefer not to deal with Iran. They don't want to have to worry about it. They almost don't want to make friends with Iran. It's almost that we don't want to get too friendly because we know eventually you're going to backtrack and you will do something to us again down the road. We can't trust you in the first place.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And the other side of the pincer is, of course, Turkey. Turkey was a loyal and forthright NATO member, spurned by the European Union, and is now under Erdogan, as the new president, increasingly Muslim and increasingly Shiite Muslim. So this pincer movement is coming, Iran and Turkey, into that whole area of the world, and it's very oil sensitive, which is important to Europe and America, and of course our Sunni friends in Saudi Arabia, we seem on the surface to be deserting them in favor of Iran. I don't know what the reality is underneath the table on that question, but it's a very interesting thing. We're playing both sides. And but my worry, my real concern for the future is that we've done some major concession for Iran to get them to play just as you are, and it's going to be costly from a nuclear threat in the future.
When you talk about playing both sides, though, we've gotten in trouble doing that before. So is it possible to actually get something done in that area of the Middle East with these governments without playing both sides? Because sooner or later, one side's going to find out what you did with the other. It's all going to work in concert, and everybody's going to be angry again. We're going to be right back where we were before. So is it possible to do anything without playing these side games?
Well, despite the administration having hollowed out our military, America is still very powerful, particularly powerful in intelligence from satellite. The new vital ground of military is space. We have intelligence, we have missile systems which are smart, and therefore still very powerful even without troops on the ground. And I think the British 50 years ago and beyond played both sides, and I think the Americans have inherited that strategy and maybe even ability. But the big question for Americans to answer is what's gone on under the table? Has there been a deal with nuclear Iran, which will hasten a nuclear weapon in Iran and therefore really upset world politics, because it would go into what we would see as an irresponsible hands.
It almost seems as if we always come back around to the Iranian nuclear question, one way or another, and this does not seem to be anything that we can really stop. And I'm just being honest here, because you'd like to be able to think that America, the EU, Britain, the other powers are able to stop this from happening. It's going to happen sooner or later, right? We just have to try and keep it later instead of sooner and delay it as much as possible.
Well, I agree with the last part of what you said. We've got to keep it later rather than sooner. But whether it actually will happen, it is such a threat to Israel's survival, and I think to Europe and the West. It would reunite the things between the European NATO members and the United States. We would all suffer from an irresponsible holder of a nuclear weapon.
Let me ask you about when you talked about breaking Iraq into factions again, and this has been talked about before, that maybe it's time to just let the country go, let it split, stop this, maybe create an entirely new country that's split into three pieces. Whether you have a new country, whether you have an old country, whether you split them into pieces, give the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Kurds, all the different areas, aren't we still going to come back to it right again? These factions never stop fighting. It's almost ingrained in their generational DNA that they have to continue to fight. They've been doing it for so long now. There's really no way to stop that, though, is there, no matter what you do?
Well, I think the question, history would say the answer is leadership. The first person really to unite the Arabs was Muhammad, and the first person to unite Saudi Arabia was the Saudi king Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And they did it with brilliant leadership, both of them. And part of that leadership is ideology and not fighting. But it's tough. I mean, historically they've fought. When Gertrude Bell drew the original frontiers of Iraq, she did it on a sort of map, when drawing lines with compass bearings. And then the British and the French, and she did it in 1911, 1914. 2 years later, the British and French did it more officially. And then it was confirmed in 1990 in the present borders, and that Britain would have control over Palestine. But they were all done by powerful nations that could impose their will. Nobody dared to start fighting when the French and British, having just won the First World War, were there. But other than that, it has to be done by leadership.
Which is always the question in Iraq.
Right.
Couple of minutes, exactly, here in America at home as well. A couple of minutes we have left here. America right now is involved in airstrikes. What happens when we run out of targets to hit?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because targets to hit depends on intelligence. And so some intelligence can come from our satellite spy, but the best intelligence is on the ground, and we have very little of that in Iraq. Historically, Iraq has been a very difficult, when I've been to Iraq, you feel this tremendous pressure underneath Saddam Hussein. It's a worrying, concerning thing, similar to going to Soviet Russia in the old days. And you can feel it all around you, even though you're a perfectly innocent traveler. And I think our intelligence on the ground is missing. And, you know, this is huge areas of land. And to be pinpoint strikes, I mean, we would almost break our treasury over again if we really nailed the place. You have to find targets for these very expensive weapons, and that depends on intelligence, largely on the ground.
And ISIS is changing its tactics. They understand these are not a bunch of stupid people just hanging out in the desert somewhere.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think they've been called off by Iran. And that's why the thing is, their fanatical leaders have been influenced by Iran, maybe with money, maybe with promises of future support and all that sort of thing. I mean, the Middle East is a cauldron of cross relationships, and you're now talking about Sunni and Shiite doing a deal.
But you're very big into the Iranian connection here as the puppet control, as the puppet master.
Iran, and I see a Shiite noose coming around in the North Turkey, which is less aggressive at the moment, but it's sliding through, but much more aggressively from Iran. And that raises fears about Israel's future. And I mean, I cannot believe that we allowed Hamas to rocket Israel without calling for United Nations. I mean, it was unbelievable. This is what the United Nations is all about, to protect against that very thing. Same thing about the threatened thing last week or the beginning of this week in the Kurds up in the mountain. I mean, why weren't we calling on the United Nations? I just don't understand that.
That is a discussion for another day. Unfortunately, we were all out of time because we're just touching the surface. John, always a pleasure to see you again, my friend. Thanks so much for coming in. The discussion that will never go away, obviously. All right, later on this hour, News Call takes us inside the coverage of Ferguson, Missouri. And after the break, around the dial to see what happened to Robin Williams, and it's having a real impact on those coming to grips with depression and a whole lot more. That's all coming up right here on MidPoint, where every day we question everything.